when I go back and I think about how I was feeling the day Obama was elected, and I'm not going to make any bones about being partisan when it comes to politics, because I am very partisan, so I'm not even going to try to walk down any unbiased road, because I won't be able to do that. But, you know, I recall feeling so happy, and aside from the fact that I thought that I wouldn't be embarrassed when I traveled around outside the United States and tell people I was an American, I really thought that we had this incredible opportunity for change. And I must say, you know, it hasn't been a year yet. And it's not that today I feel cynical about what his administration has done. It just has become incredibly clear to me that the change that we need is not going to happen because of him or his administration. That he will move things in the right direction, and he's doing that. But the fundamental systemic changes that we need to bring about to have a more just and equitable economy are not going to happen because we have a new administration in the White House. We need a far broader coalition than that to make these changes happen. And as I look around at the world, particularly as we begin to hear and see in the news media all of these signs that things are getting back to normal. You know, the stock market is moving up. It's probably moved up further, faster, in a shorter amount of time in the last 6 months than it has ever moved in that positive direction before. And I think that sends, unfortunately, a terribly confusing message to the public, because things aren't getting back to normal. Unemployment's going up, the condition of our environment is getting worse, and there is so much momentum to return to normal. In some ways, I begin to worry that we will waste this crisis, because, as I think, I don't know who said, someone said, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. Who was that? No one knows.
Obama's chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel.
Rahm Emanuel? Did Rahm Emanuel say that? Okay. So, or he stole it from someone else. We don't know, but we'll give him credit. I'm afraid that in many respects we are on the verge of wasting this crisis by creating the illusion that things are getting back to normal, and we don't really want them to get back to normal. And you know, I guess my conclusion is that it's not Obama that was the person we were waiting for, that we are the people we were waiting for, because it's going to take all of us, all of you, playing a very active role in this if we're going to see the kinds of changes that we're talking about. And what I want to sort of briefly sketch out is some thinking about what those changes are and how we might begin to approach them. From a foundational perspective, and I think this will be familiar to anyone who's here, one of the biggest challenges that we face is the fact that we live in this highly compartmentalized world. A world in which we've taken everything apart. There's environmentalists, and there's people that think about human rights, and there's lawyers, and there's accountants, and everybody has their specialty. And unfortunately, when it comes to activists and people working on progressive issues, they work just the same way. You know, people are concerned about global warming, and other people are concerned about human rights, and other people are concerned about the preservation of some fish species, and they don't realize that all these things are bound up together, and that, in fact, if we can't look at these things, and as I'm sure all of you have learned, from a systemic perspective, we can't create the kind of lasting change that will have the effects that we want it to have. And in some respects, one of the biggest challenges we face is the challenge of bringing people together so that they can see how that without working together, they won't fix their particular issue. Someone who is concerned about equity and justice and someone who's concerned about global warming, until those issues are integrally related, and that without seeing how we need to work together to deal with both of those issues, we won't provide and create a lasting solution to either one of them. And I think from a foundational perspective, this may be the single biggest challenge we face. Someone has recently counted, I think it was Paul Hawken, 2 million NGOs around the world, and each one of them have separate areas of focus. They have separate funding mechanisms. Their work is discussed in specialized magazines. They have conferences on their specialized interests, and all over, we have created these silos. I mean, we see it within our business. How do we get everyone within the same company to think about what's best for the whole rather than what's best in their particular area? So that is in some respects a goal, and I mean, I think that we have some models that are emerging for that are hopeful. We have something that we have participated in called the Sustainable Palm Oil Roundtable. So I don't know how much you guys know about sustainable palm oil, but the planting of palm oil plantations have wiped out half the forest in Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, and are one of the biggest contributors to global warming on the face of the earth. And it took getting the consumer products companies, the manufacturers, government, NGOs, the farmers, human rights people, every single constituent in this system sitting around the same table to agree on the problem and collectively begin to craft solutions in order to begin to make a little progress. The same thing is happening in the cocoa industry, the chocolate industry, where today 50% of the production and marketing and sale of cocoa is represented by a single organization that now talks about how to solve some of the fundamental problems that we are facing. So we know it's possible to get the stakeholders into the room. We're trying to get a bigger and more diverse group of stakeholders than is generally been accomplished in the past. I think that there's also somewhat of a shift in values and consciousness that has to happen in order for this change to take place. I think you've been exposed to a lot of the thinking about how things like, the way we measure our progress doesn't accurately reflect the progress that we would like to make. And so fundamentally, I think we have to look at our set of values. And one of them is the whole notion of quantity versus quality. We have an economy that is fundamentally built on accumulating stuff. And it accumulates more and more stuff that takes more and more of a toll on the environment. And we don't value, in a sense, accumulating things that don't take such a toll on the environment. So, education is something that can proliferate without usually the huge impact that selling t-shirts or selling sneakers has on the globe. And yet, in some ways, we constrain the growth of education while we encourage the proliferation of people accumulating stuff. And unfortunately, in some respects, particularly in countries like the United States, we've come to believe that it is that accumulation of stuff that actually makes us happy, when all of the research that has been done over the past few years basically shows that once you reach a certain level of income, it is things like the quality of your relationships, your involvement in community, that really differentiate differentiate happy people from less happy people. Yet, you know, we live in a society where we spend more and more and more time trying to make more and more money. Basically allows us to buy more and more stuff. As Gar Alperovitz, who was at both of the gatherings we have, has written, you know, this conversation about working less hours as a society has almost become a taboo socialist conversation, when in fact he argues very effectively that you can't have a healthy democracy if people don't have time to participate in it. We need time to participate in our community organizations. We need time to go to town meeting. We need time to build relationships with our neighbors. And yet our society is creating more and more reasons for us to work more and more hours, not participating in those institutions, which actually compromise the ability to create a healthy democracy. Another thing, and I sort of feel like this group is, and maybe I should speed through this, I mean, are these things that everybody's deeply conversant with already?
You can ask. Probably in this group, they're fairly conversant.
So let me go into some of the more prescriptive things rather than lay a foundation, which you guys probably already have. So I won't talk about the long term versus the short term. I won't talk about meaning versus matter. I won't talk about some of the other qualitative, values-oriented things that we need to focus on, and instead talk a little bit more practically about some of the solutions that we need. And I think, you know, first of all, we have to be willing to talk about, I would say, some radical solutions that, generally speaking, are not on the table in most conversations. You know, I have been in several dialogues over the past few months where we talked about things like income redistribution. And people said, you know, I can't believe we're having this conversation, because in a sense, particularly in business circles, that's almost a taboo conversation to have. You can do lots of things, but you can't talk about redistributing income because it's a socialist or a communist notion, and you can't, you know, you don't really have the space to have the conversation that you can't have a sustainable world when ownership and wealth is concentrated amongst 1% of the population. Yet, you know, we have all these conversations about sustainability and about the environment and about responsible business, often without putting on the table some of the issues that are the most foundational to making the kind of systemic change that is required. So I'm going to talk briefly about 8 or 9 different areas if I have the time. One of them is about sustainable business, and I'll probably skip some of them given this group, but the areas I talk about are sustainable business, I talk about education, I talk about communication and conscious consumption, transparency and disclosure, national economic planning, which again is somewhat of a taboo subject, creating vibrant local economies, policy and regulation, and national security. Now, if you have a particular one of those that you're the most interested in, does someone have an area that they're passionate to hear about that they want me to focus on first?
Sustainable business.
Sustainable business, okay. So let me start with that. Having tried to run a sustainable business for the past 21 years, one of the things that you learn very quickly is that the deck is stacked against you. It's hard enough starting a small business to begin with. Whether it's political influence, I mean, the truth is you've got the Chamber of Commerce that spends lots and lots of money that is really supporting the interests of very large and increasingly a selective group of companies. Small business, particularly sustainable small business, really doesn't even have a voice or a place at the table. And you know, you think about this whole healthcare debate, and you think about how beneficial it will be for small business, and yet the Chamber of Commerce aggressively lobbies against the very thing that will actually help all small businesses, let alone sustainable small businesses. So we live in this strange dichotomy. We also live in a world where, you know, and I'll make this particular seventh generation. I mean, seventh generation sells recycled paper. Even last year, the government spent $1 billion a year causing virgin paper to cost less than recycled paper. They did that by building roads, by creating very inexpensive ways for people to get the rights to cut down trees. So one would think, if you were a consumer, that if you're buying a recycled paper that's made from garbage, it should cost less than it would cost to go out into the forest, cut a tree down, and process the tree. But we have engineered the system to cause the very things that are good for us and better for our environment to often cost more money. And that is compounded, as you know, because of the way businesses can externalize their costs. So if we think about organic food, you could make the argument that the companies that are selling organic food should have a benefit because they're not polluting the groundwater, they're not endangering the lives of farm workers, but because businesses who are farming in a traditional way and causing tremendous loss of topsoil, causing all kinds of negative externalities, don't pay for those things. Yet you go to the supermarket and traditional food costs more money than organic food when it shouldn't. So from a foundational perspective, without full cost accounting, I would say that in many sectors of the economy, sustainable business will be at a disadvantage. They're also at a disadvantage because of the way capital works, which is we have incentivized people to make very short-term investments. And in fact, a business like Seventh Generation, when we're raising money, we're looking for someone to put the money into the company for 10, 20, if not 50 years, but they're not incentivized to leave their money in that long because they want liquidity. They are not paying a tax on a short-term investment. I mean, if you think about it, 25% of the volume on the New York Stock Exchange right now, anybody know how long those investments are made for? 25%?
A day or less.
Now it's down to seconds. 25% of the volume of the trading on the New York Stock Exchange is these computer trading models that are in and out of a stock in a matter of seconds. Hopefully that will become illegal because these people actually know that there are orders coming into the market for a stock. Before those orders reach the market, they buy, the order comes, and they resell. And they might make a fraction of a penny. This is creating no value, but it's using lots of capital. And again, you know, I think that a lot of unsustainable, what we might call bad businesses, are not run by bad people, but they're people that, in some respects, are sort of following the rules and incentives that we set out for them. We also have no infrastructure to pass the learnings from sustainable businesses on to other companies. I mean, we need, you know, not classes and departments. I mean, we need a whole institutional infrastructure that teaches businesses how to operate in a sustainable world, particularly when the regulatory issues are stacked against them. You know, an issue that we have faced and that one is of great interest to a lot of people is the whole issue of, you know, the first generation of sustainable businesses. You know, where are most of those companies today, the companies that started 15, 20 years ago? Who knows where the majority of those companies have gone, other than out of business? They're part of, sorry?
They've been bought out?
Yeah. So Ben & Jerry's, Stonyfield, The Body Shop. You know, if you go into a natural food store, the majority of what you will see on the shelf are brands that are now owned by multinational food companies. And consumers don't know it. 99% of the people that buy Ben & Jerry's ice cream don't know that it's owned by Unilever and run by the Good Humor division within Unilever. they see Ben's smiling face and they, think it's this happy little Vermont company. So the capital questions, the questions of how to create stability over the long term, and you have a whole host of legal and regulatory issues that are also challenging. We don't have laws that allow, in most states, companies to take all stakeholders into account when they make a decision. So if you're a shareholder, and this was actually an interesting dynamic when Ben & Jerry's was sold, there's actually a law in Vermont that allows you to not sell your company to the highest offer if it would have a negative effect on your community. And you could have argued that the unemployment that would result from selling Ben & Jerry's to Unilever would be such a case. But they didn't want to go in court and fight that battle, so in the end they took the offer from the highest bidder. So do people know about B Corporation? Raise your hand if you do. So some of you do. It's something that's important to pay attention to because they will be introducing in 2010 into the Vermont legislature a new corporate form called a B for Benefit Corporation. That will be a new class of company that will be chartered, among other things, to proactively consider the impact on all stakeholders, not just shareholders, when they make a decision. And we need those kinds of structural changes to facilitate. And the hope is that by passing a law like that, we will attract companies to want to do business in Vermont because we offer that. And it will be good for the state as well as provide some new protection to companies. Yes?
Can you give me an example of some of the other stakeholders that they would bring into the picture?
Yeah, well, let's say at the top of the list, your employees. So if your company is not meeting its earnings target, the first thing you do is not fire 10% of your workforce. But the other stakeholders would be the environment, local communities in which you're doing business in, and all of the members within your supply chain. And today, you're at risk, a lawyer would argue, if you make a decision that's in the best interest of your employees, but not in the best interest of your investors. So B Corporation, which seventh generation is a B Corporation, we changed the bylaws of our company so that we adopted bylaws that said directors are directed to consider all stakeholders when they make a decision, not just the investors.
Do you have to be able to put numbers on those stakeholders on there?
No. Maybe at some point down the line, but right now it's a relatively simple change to your bylaws.
When did you change the bylaws?
A year ago. We were one of the first companies to actually do that. And even as a private, socially responsible company, our lawyer had 100 reasons why we shouldn't do this. We're going to increase our directors and officers' liability insurance because we've changed these bylaws. We live in a society where this runs against the grain. Someone else had a question. Yes.
Yeah, I'm very interested in how the SEC regulations for securities affects a business ability to act in a sustainable way, and I'm wondering if that has anything to do with it, or what your thoughts are on reforming kind of in a way, investments and shares are bought and sold and traded and regulated relate to this.
So we have to deal with all of those structural issues, and some of them are SEC related, which mostly affect public companies. We were a public company from 93 to 99, and then we went back to being a private company. It is harder to be a responsible, sustainable business as a public company because the public markets punish you when you do anything that isn't in the short-term best interest of your shareholders. And unlike our company, where we have people who have long-term investments, your shareholders are transient when you're a public company. What is remarkable, though, is that when you actually look at where the ownership of most of these public companies is, it's in pension funds, it's in religious organizations, and this whole financial system is, in a sense, really not acting in the best interest of the people whose money they're deploying. Have you guys studied CalPERS at all? CalPERS is a $250 billion pension fund for teachers in California. And they are a usually progressive, unusually activist investor. And Phil Angeles, who was the treasurer, once did an analysis, and he was thinking about investing in pharmaceutical companies. And what he realized was that he could invest $5 in a pharmaceutical company and maybe get $10 back because their stock went up and the dividends were good. But when he actually then analyzed the cost of that to the people in the pension fund, he realized that for every dollar he made through investing in their pension money, the pensioners were paying $2 in higher cost to buy those drugs. So it was a bad investment. That really, if he's thinking about the long-term best interests of the people whose money he's investing, the system is not going to deliver him the results he wanted. And he defines profit. Should a company that has a devastating effect on the environment, that has a devastating effect on communities, be considered profitable? How can a company actually generate a profit when they've cost 10 times what they've made in profit in adverse health effects to the communities in which we're operating in? But that's the case today. Many large companies site their plants in low-income neighborhoods that need the employment and can't fight the factories. And when you actually think about the health effect and the environmental effect that they have on those communities relative to the profit they're making, it doesn't make sense. But we've defined these things in such a narrow way as to let, and in some ways encourages businesses to operate in that fashion. I have to remember back to my days of being a public company, but one of the things that, I think in some respects the new legislation that was passed to create more transparency for public companies is a good thing. I don't think that they've gone about doing it in some cases the best ways. Has anybody ever read a 10K statement by a company? So, 3 people in the room. The 10K statement or the 10Q, which is the quarterly statement, is the primary vehicle around which a company is forced by the SEC to create transparency. Well, it is the most god-awful, boring, repetitive document you've ever read. And it's not a document that encourages engagement or that most people would want to read. So we need to do this in a little bit more user-friendly fashion. And you also won't find the 10K disclosure covering a lot of the things that interest you the most. You won't get much disclosure in detail around the health and environmental impacts that the company might have on the communities in which they do business in. You won't find out what the turnover rate of the employees are in comparison to their industry peers. When I invest in a company, I look at the turnover rate as one key indicator of what it's like to work at that company. And if your turnover rate is much higher than your peers, my sense is that management's doing something wrong, which is they're not treating their people well enough to want to stay around. So for me as an investor, that would be a key consideration. But there's no requirement to disclose that kind of information through the SEC. So raise your hand, ask a question, interrupt me. That will be the best way to ensure that I talk about what you're interested in. Yes?
From a practical business standpoint, knowing obviously what you know about publicly traded companies and the amount of capital and businesses, and obviously seventh generation has been a very successful company in its category, but do you think that you just laid out is actually possible?
I think
To be applied.
Yeah.
Obviously, to be discussed and to be theorized and to maybe take bits and pieces, but to literally lay out all of that, do you think it can be a model for our entire economy and our entire
I think what we have to do, that we failed to do, is to show people how some of these changes are really in their best interest. So, if we talk about full cost accounting or we talk about changing capital gains taxes, whether you're concerned about global warming or whether you're concerned about human rights, you have to be able to show people how this change is beneficial for them and move beyond this highly compartmentalized agenda that we have had in the past. So, again, some of these conversations we've been having, particularly the one in Washington and one that I had last weekend at MIT, is, if you're from the labor community, if you're from the environmental community, if you're from the finance community, can we agree on the kinds of changes that will be beneficial to all of us and then organize ourselves in that way? I mean, to me, there's no question that the majority of public, the majority of business, actually wants these things to happen. It's in their best interest. Somehow we've let them be convinced that the chamber, the Republican Party, or other entities are acting in their best interest. I mean, it amazes me. How is it possible that, a Republican administration can change tax laws in ways that increasingly benefit only the most wealthy 5% of the population? Why would so many people vote for an elected representative who takes that position? To me, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So I believe it's possible. I mean, I think that the challenge for all of you and the challenge of your age is to move beyond making these very compartmentalized changes and enroll and help create a strategy that makes the changes that will really bring about the kind of world that we want. I mean, that's, to me, the greatest challenge of, the next couple of decades. And I may not be around long enough to see it all come to fruition. So it will ultimately lie on your shoulders to make sure that that happens. Yes, Greg?
When you were talking about short-term investment being taxed differently than long-term investment, my understanding is in the state of Vermont, where we've got some pretty good land conservation laws, one of the laws is that if you buy land kind of as a speculator, we protect against that by taxing you if you sell it before 6 years. I think it's 6 years.
But
So
I think that only applies to real estate.
yeah, but so let's take that template.
It's a good model.
Yeah, it's a good model, and what we do in Vermont maybe can resonate across the country.
Absolutely. We have many laws in Vermont that are models for what is best for the whole nation, whether it's, we have passed a law that says if you put up a windmill, your utility has to buy that energy at 20 cents a kilowatt hour, and if you put up solar at your house, they have to buy it at 30 cents a kilowatt hour. So they're beginning to change the economics of using renewable energy in Vermont. But it takes those structural changes. You can talk about global warming till you're blue in the face, but if, there's a 50-year payback on doing something, a lot of people aren't doing it. So these are those are both, whether it's the real estate speculative tax or the alternative energy incentive, exactly the kinds of great changes that we have to put in place. The challenge we face is figuring out the sequence of what we should do first and building broad enough coalitions to bring about those changes. You had a question in the back.
Yeah, I think you kind of were answering it a couple questions ago, but I guess my question was, in the last few years, there's been a lot of progress within the current systems and structures. Some examples, I think it was something like last year, 1 out of every 9 or 10 investment dollars in the U.S. went to green or social funds. Time Magazine, I'm sure you are well aware, just came out with a big poll that they commissioned showing a huge rise in consumer activism and considering social environmental issues in their purchasing decisions, at least they claim to. And it seems like things are moving in the right direction, at least within the current structures. And so my general question was, do you see that progress and the continuation of that as an option? But it sounds to me like you don't.
The challenge is that 11% of all investment dollars are now screened. Now what that means is that money doesn't go into companies who are making military equipment. It doesn't go into tobacco and alcohol companies. That's like, unfortunately, making sure we don't do the worst thing is not going to get us to a good place. And so it shows us the potential. Here, 11% of all the money cares enough to screen it. That's really different. If 11% of all the investment dollars were invested in some kind of certified sustainable business, the problem is it's less than 0.1% that's invested in what I would consider sustainable companies, and we don't have any guidelines to determine what a sustainable company is. So this is an issue that even plagues sustainable business, which is most good companies, most sustainable companies, most of the companies you probably love and support, I would argue, seventh generation included, are less bad than their competitors. I would not stand here and argue that seventh generation is on a net basis making the world a better place. You know, we just haven't gotten there yet. The products we sell are less bad than the other products you might buy. But in order for us to be good, we don't have to just be sustainable, we have to be regenerative. We have to be so good that we are actually helping repair the damage in the world to get it back to where it has to be. We have to be actively dealing with issues like justice and equity. And so the fear that I have is that we have come to a point in time where being less bad has gotten confused with being good. And so we do lots of symbolic things. We buy a Prius, we invest our money in a Calvert mutual fund, and we eat organic food. And unfortunately, that's not enough. Unfortunately, we're not changing the systemic things that are causing the problems we're trying to change. Now, I don't want to say those are bad things. I don't want people to stop driving their Prius or stop eating organic food. But we have to understand that those things enough will not change the trajectory we're on. I mean, when I was on Monday with the UN Commissioner for the Environment, who has this responsibility of getting all these nations around the world to sign up for enough CO2 reductions so that the world doesn't become a disaster. And I mean, this man knows the science, and he's beside himself with despair that not only hasn't the U.S. passed the climate change legislation that's in front of the Senate, but he knows that even if we pass it, what we'll do is delay the worst effects of climate change by maybe a decade. And that legislation doesn't even come close to dealing with the changes that we have to make. Now, some people who I'm not among them, believe that, so global warming will come and it'll wipe out a large part of the human race and we'll try to rebuild and do it all over again better next time. The reason I don't subscribe to that is that the reality is that devastation, as you saw in New Orleans, will be worse for the poorest people and the people who are least able to protect themselves from whether it's disease or whether it's weather. And so it will be an unjust cleansing of the human race, if you like, that I think we need to work hard to avoid. So, I want to also give you a few other examples because, I think about, not a lot of people in this room probably have a second home, but if you go buy a second home and take out a mortgage on the second home, you get a deduction for the interest you pay. Now, people that can afford to buy a second home arguably don't need a tax benefit on that second home. Why do we have it? Why do we have a system where a company can deduct as an expense $20 million that they pay to their CEO? I think there should be a cap of $500,000, and you want to pay your CEO more than $500,000, you don't get a tax deduction for it. You can't offset that against your expenses. And again, those are the kinds of structural changes we need to make. And most of them aren't even on the table now because we don't have the political constituency. We haven't built the coalitions that are required to support those kinds of initiatives. What direction would you guys like me to go in? Because I'll do best with the time I have. what subject would be?
About back to the some of the political issues and how to change the tax structure. I mean, after the Depression, FDR was managed to really radically change and make the tax structure more progressive, and that did create the whole middle class in the United States,
Yeah.
which is now going
Yes.
the other direction.
Yeah.
Can we go back, and what would it take to do that? I mean,
So,
is that so taboo, or is that?
well, one of the things we have to do is take the money out of politics. I don't believe, most politicians, and we live in a state that is unlike most states. Most states don't have the kind of federal representatives we have in Vermont. Most representatives are representing the interests of big business because that's who got them elected. And it is often the representatives of those businesses that are writing legislation. Now, some of that's changing, but I don't believe that until we get the money out of politics, we will make some of those changes. How much, if you were to guess, how much would you have to pay every year to publicly finance all elections? There would be no candidate would raise any money, no money could come from any business. All elections would be financed publicly. How much do you think it would cost you to write a check to do that?
Do you mean at the current spending level?
Yes, at the current spending levels.
$200.
$6. If everyone paid $6 a year, we could eliminate all funding of public elections, finance them at the current level. And our former governor, Madeline Kunin, one of her primary focuses is complete public funding of campaigns. And $6 is not untenable. Again, we have to show people why that's really in their best interest. It's in the best interest of the middle class for that to happen. It's in the best interest of most people other than very wealthy people and businesses. But we've done a terrible job communicating. And, again, we have another problem, which is the ownership of the media. I mean, the media has become a highly concentrated, from an ownership perspective. And, systemically, I think that's a challenge because some of the messages that need to get out don't get out. But I would say in order for us to make some of those tax changes that have to be voted on by the House, we would have to dramatically change the composition. Because as we're seeing, the fact that the Democrats have a majority doesn't mean that much. It doesn't mean you can go past global warming legislation. It doesn't mean you can pass health care legislation. Because a lot of those senators and House representatives, people in the House, don't necessarily see those as things that they can support and get reelected. Other questions? Yes.
This might take up a topic, but I'm just thinking about when you were talking about before with seventh generation maybe not having a positive net benefit on the world, and you talked about how maybe the goal in the future is to be regenerating. So how do you address the current state of your business? Sorry, if the goal is to grow, which is the goal right now, and if you can argue that growth is connected to more wasted products, wasted materials, is the goal then to be in the future that business could be growing, but as they're growing, they're regenerating?
Yeah, I think
society.
Fundamentally, we have to re-examine the notion of this endless growth that we're in the process of. And I think that we have to change the way we think about growing to focus more on qualitative issues than quantitative issues. But in the short term, what seventh generation does is we do a corporate responsibility report that you can read online, and we quantify our impact. So when we first did this report, 5-6 years ago, and the way we look at it is in a life cycle way. So we look at the extraction of natural resources through to the way people use our products through to their disposal. So we thought we understood what our impacts were. we did this analysis and we were wrong. The single greatest negative effect was the fact that we sold many products that required people to heat up water to use them, whether it's auto dish detergent, whether it's dish liquid, whether it's laundry liquid, and about 80% of our negative effect was the way people use the products we created. So, unless you go through the trouble of quantifying your impact, you don't know what to do. It turned out that that was a relatively easy thing to do. We redesigned our formulas to work in cold water. The harder thing was to change the way people use the products because they don't believe that they'll work in lukewarm water as well as in hot water. So if you're going to become sustainable or regenerative, you have to do the hard work of analysis, of really understanding where your impacts are. So, that's why we focused on palm oil, that when we looked at our raw materials, we came to the conclusion that we use a lot of palm oil, and that when you looked at the whole supply chain, that was having a devastatingly negative effect. So in some ways, you can't do everything at once, so you need to create a roadmap, and you need to create some kind of hierarchy, and you need to be able to say to your stakeholders, look, we're going to deal with these 10 issues. We're not going to deal with these 90 issues. And again, that's something that business has a very hard time with. Business has really a terrible time saying, we're doing all these wrong things, and we're not going to do anything about it, because we believe these issues are priorities. Now, that kind of transparency at least allows you to have a debate and a discussion with your dialogue, with your stakeholders. So to me, foundationally, again, if we're focusing on business, transparency is a requirement. You cannot be a responsible, sustainable business unless you're committed to relatively radical transparency. And that goes beyond doing a GRI, corporate responsibility report. Because you can't be the judge of whether you're a sustainable business. Your stakeholders are the ones that have to make that proclamation. If all of you were running Fortune 500 companies, you probably don't want to do that, but if I waved my magic wand and made you all CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, and I said, are you running responsible, sustainable businesses, how many hands would go up? Every hand in the room. Because all of these guys and a few girls have convinced themselves that their businesses are sustainable and their businesses are responsible. There's no definition of what that is, so they're free to describe themselves in any way they want. Does that help a little bit?
Yeah. Do you think that the GRI standards are helpful to business? Do you think that standardization across the board would be a helpful tool, or is that just where we are now and then in the future it's somewhere else?
I think it's a critically helpful tool, because without people reporting uniformly in the same way, you can't compare. How do you make a decision that this sneaker company is better than that sneaker company, or this gas station is better than that gas station, if they all use their own system of providing information? You can't make a comparison. So I am, and we've been for many years, huge supporters of the GRI principles. It's a lot of work. It costs a lot of money. But it's absolutely, I think, should be a requirement for any business that wants to consider itself sustainable and responsible. Problem is, a lot of businesses would know that they wouldn't be considered sustainable if they made some of the disclosures that would be required. And it ultimately has to come through the SEC. The SEC has to say, you want to be a public company, you have to issue a GRI report at least, because it's not going to happen voluntarily. GRI has been around for a decade, and I think there's less than 500 companies globally that report according to the GRI principles. Yeah.
You're talking about our sort of growth-based economy and how to sort of get out of that mindset. And that's a little hard to imagine how that could occur. So what are economies going to look like when the population of the Earth starts to decrease? And I believe what, it's supposed to peak out at around 10 billion or something like that, what, in 20 years?
From 6
So
billion
how-
to 9.
Yeah, so how is that, so once the population stops increasing, then presumably the whole economy will be easier to project towards a non-growth type of economy. What's it going to look like?
Well, I think if we get to 9 billion, we're in trouble. I mean, I'm not sure that 9 billion or 10 billion is
Agreed.
sustainable. So I think in the short term, we have to do everything we can to slow the growth of population.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is, if you look at Bangladesh and you look at are you guys all familiar with the Grameen Bank and what they've done in Bangladesh? I mean, what they've done has, aside from bringing down things like domestic violence dramatically, they've also dramatically slowed the growth of population, because there is a connection between population growth and huge inequity in injustice. So where they've begun to build, I wouldn't call it a middle class in Bangladesh, but they've begun to create a whole class of people that are operating and running small businesses. The ways these families are dealing with their economic challenges are not by having lots of children. They're investing in the children they have and spending that money to send them to school. So systemically, these things are connected, but the economy will look very different. I mean, I think that if you look to some of the Scandinavian countries, you'll get maybe a feeling for what it might begin to look like. And as Bob knows, I mean, the Peter Victor's book, which is called
Managing Without Growth,
is a wonderful model of what it would look like economically to slow that growth down. I mean, we also take in, we assume it's okay to have relatively high levels of unemployment. We assume it's okay for people to work so many hours. So when we're talking about changing the system, we have to look at things like not just how many hours we're working, but is it really, should we say that full employment is something that we should force the economy to provide for people? I mean, when you think about the almost 10% unemployment we have now, and you think about all the people that have stopped looking for jobs or are dramatically underemployed, or you look at some of the minority communities, you start getting up to 30% or 40% unemployment. I mean, what kind of world can we have when 40% of a particular ethnic group is unemployed? I mean, it's a totally dysfunctional economy. And one of the things that Peter Victor does is he models out all of these things in looking at what the economy would look like if you change all of these things together. So it's an absolutely terrific book. Yes?
So, is the internet the answer? If we say that the media is what's preventing us from really discussing these issues because it's owned by corporations, and we'll never get publicly financed campaigns as long as the media controls the discussion, and we'll never get any further with any of these other changes until we get the money out of politics. But the internet provides at least a possible way to get past the corporate control of the media and to democratize the media again, and that may be the fundamental change that could drive a lot of these other things. Does that scenario resonate with you?
I think that the internet is part of the solution, but I think it's instructive to look at how Obama got himself elected. I mean, he very effectively used the internet, but he also used a lot of interface between people. He used house parties. He used community dialogues. I mean, I think that the internet is a critical part because it deals with the issue of concentration of media ownership, but it can't be the only part. And one of the things that I think is the most disappointing is that the incredible organization that Obama put together to get himself elected has virtually disappeared. That infrastructure that he created, if it was alive today, would be driving his agenda around global warming and driving his agenda around healthcare reform. But unfortunately, the DNC has not invested in keeping that infrastructure up and together. And so he's lost, in a sense, that way of creating a populist voice and support for what he wants to do. But certainly we have to use and learn to use the internet in much more effective ways. And there's sporadic attempts. Move On has had some big successes. Governor Dean had some big successes. So I think that there's an increasing number of success stories. But, we don't institutionally build upon these things. I mean, I was talking earlier about the way democratic progressive organizations tend to fund things versus the Republican Party. And, we take this highly compartmentalized approach to the way we fund things and the way we support things. So we have project-specific grants rather than, investing in an idea over a 10-year period of time, which some of the organizations on the right will do. So we need, I think the challenge, and I don't have all the answers, is how do you pull all these pieces together? And in what sequence do you attack the challenges? So we have a lot to learn from what Obama did when he got elected, but it's a crime that we're not building on that, because that would be a huge engine in attacking many of the problems that we're talking about today.
Great.
So
Maybe it's a good time to
take other questions?
Yeah,
Or
the question, at least first, let's thank.
Well, I didn't go
Thank
through my
Jeffrey.
speech in any coherent fashion, but so questions? Any more questions?
We'll stay here as long as you're willing to stay.
But I mean, also, you have the opportunity to ask me anything you would like to ask. So I always say, particularly when I speak on college campuses, I'm looking for the person that will ask me a question I will refuse to answer. And I have yet to find that to happen. So, yeah.
I don't think this is that question. But I sometimes wonder if, as companies like Seventh Generation, they have so much success, presumably part of it is because your efforts towards sustainability help distinguish you from your competitors. And as more and more companies say, well, geez, they're making money that way, now we even see GE and others making billions of dollars doing that, at some point it's no longer going to distinguish you from your competitors when everybody's doing it. And is that a concern among corporate leaders and people like yourself?
I mean, we have more competition than we've ever had. We have competition from SC Johnson. We have competition from Clorox. We have competition from Kimberly-Clark. We have competition from Colgate-Palmolive. And the ground upon which the competition is taking place is green products, not green companies. So we haven't effectively communicated to consumers that it is important to think about who you're buying from, not just what you're buying. So Huggies Naturals puts 1% organic cotton in their diaper, and now it's a natural diaper. Now, that 1% doesn't do much of anything for anybody, particularly since it's conventional cotton, I believe not organic cotton. It's probably worse than using wood pulp in the diaper because of the pesticide intensity of the crop. But a consumer sees the word natural and thinks that it's better. So I am very concerned about that. Now, one issue is that Seventh Generation has to be more effective at communicating and having a dialogue with our customers that helps them see those differences. And we haven't done a very good job of that. I would say we failed to do that effectively.